Well, that's a good, well, actually, that's going to be our last class on itinerancy. The big Franciscan tradition, the journey. And actually, it's probably the one area that distinguishes, okay, we'll wait, the Franciscans from everybody else. Oh, okay, well, let me get started. So, wait a minute. Make sure I can do this right. Okay. So we're going to talk about the 4 pillars of the Franciscan tradition. And the first pillar today will be poverty. And the second pillar next week will be minority. The third pillar will be community. And I'm calling it community because if I told you what the Franciscans call it, people would say it's sexist. They call it fraternity. But I'll explain at that time why fraternity is a gender-neutral word. And the last one will be on itinerancy, which gets into the journey. And these are the 4 pillars of the Franciscan tradition. Now, within the Roman Catholic Church, and for that matter, throughout that part of Christianity, which would include Anglicans, as well as Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Christians. Oriental Christians are the Armenians, Coptics, Syrians, Abyssinians, and so forth. There are 4 rules. The rule of St. Basil, the rule of St. Benedict, the rule of St. Augustine, and the rule of St. Francis. And so the Franciscans do have their own rule. Now, one of the things that is, tell a quick story. When I went to the Franciscans International Study Center, which is actually in England, in 2004 for my sabbatical, and I was a fellow in residence, and I studied all kind of things about St. Francis. And one of the things that they had everybody do, whether they were in the sabbatical program, the formation program, these are people that wanted to be like novice masters and so forth, degree programs, whatever it was, we went on these day-long visits to other religious institutions. So this day we went over to Minster, and the Franciscan International Study Center is in Canterbury, just up the hill from the Canterbury Cathedral. And that part of England juts out into the English Channel in the North Sea. And so we went over to Minster, and here were all these nuns, black and white habits, I mean, real pre-Vatican II. And about halfway through the morning, I started thinking, this is just too Roman Catholic for me. And I come out of the more Catholic side of our church. You know, that's the tradition. I'm still very wed to that. And so we had a break in the middle of the day, and I went out and was standing in the courtyard. And Catherine Dunn, who is a nun from Dublin, a good friend of mine, came to me, and she said, thought I was going to die in there. I said, what? She says, John, didn't you see nonverbal communications? We were all miserable. Well, what was they were learning about a tradition that's not their own. So it's kind of like trying to write with your other hand, the hand you don't. And religious life is like that. Prayer life is like that. If it fits for you, that's what you do. If it doesn't, you do something else. So there is some unique things about the Franciscan. And I do Franciscan spiritual direction. I am not affiliated with the Society of St. Francis as Chris Lynn Payne is, and as Amy will become, because I have a special relationship with the Roman Catholics, and I kind of like to keep that. I feel it's a bridge. So, but in the spiritual direction that I do, and one person comes to me and say, well, I want to do the Franciscan tradition. I said, well, isn't there a single book I can read? And I said, no, you're going to discover it's really got a lot of interpretation to it. It's structured as the Ignatian, which is the Jesuits, or the Benedictine. After about 2 weeks, he said, I don't like this. I said, good, you don't belong there. You go for someplace else. So I'll try to share what these pillars mean. And even though you're in a church named for St. Francis and something else appeals to you spiritually, don't let that bother you. That's not a problem. So now today I want to talk about poverty. And I've done this program for various groups, and I was asked to do this for the Order of Urban Missioners, which is a group of clergy and laity out of Holy Nativity on Pimlico Road in Park Heights. And it's an order of people that are committed to working in the city, and was set up by the Reverend Victoria Sirota and the Reverend Mary Davidson. It has kind of gone into, since Victoria's not here anymore and Mary's retired, I think it's kind of gone into some quiet, not nearly as visible as it once was. But I was getting out of my car, and this gentleman came to me, and he said, "Bishop, I saw what you're going to talk about. You're going to talk about poverty. And I trust you're somehow going to give us some good news. But I know poverty, and it's not good news." So I need to say that when we talk about the Franciscan view of poverty, it's not the same as you may think. You're not going to have to go up on York Road with your baking bowls and hope people will feed you. That's not what it is. So this is the first pillar. Now, if I'm doing this right, whoops. Now, let me give you a couple of ideas here. There are 4 good books about Francis. I didn't bring them all with me. The first one is The Life of St. Francis by Paul Sabatier, which actually is still in print, but it was written in 1894. And it picks up the first idea of Francis being a real reformer. Now, at that time in medieval thinking, we were still looking at the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages. Now, having taught medieval history at a college level before I went to seminary, I can assure you that's not the case anymore. The medieval time was an incredibly creative time. In fact, I called my course on medieval history the European Renaissances. But Sabatier picked up on Francis. Now, there's one small problem with Sabatier. He's a Protestant. So guess what they did with his book? They put it on the index of prohibited books. It's off now. The Reluctant Saint by Donald Spoto. Spoto is religiously trained, but he's written all kinds of biographies, including Grace Kelly, Alfred Hitchcock. And it's a very readable biography, and it's written with a kind of nice narrative. Oops, I misspelled Assisi there. St. Francis of Assisi, The Rise of a Gospel Life by Regis Armstrong, is a good synopsis of those writings of Francis that are unique to Francis. What's unique to Francis is the Canticle of the Creatures, which is his autobiography, Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, the Testament of 1224, and of course the earlier rule of 1221. And then probably the best biography is this Performing the Gospel by Lawrence Cunningham of Notre Dame University. And his point is that Francis was a student of what he calls virtual theology, which is a lived out theology. Now, assuming I can get back to my work after Easter, I'm working on a work called Preached by Our Deeds, which is from the earlier rule of 1221. And I'm going to argue that the Franciscan tradition is both orthodox and praxis. It's both. It's not, people usually think of the Franciscans as orthopraxic, good practice, and the Dominicans as being, about good theology. Now, even though they're cousins of each other, the Franciscans and the Dominicans don't always speak nicely of one another. And I was at the Franciscan Study Center, they'd say the Doms. Oh, the Doms do this, the Doms do that. So, anyway, if you run into any books by Elia Delio, D-E-L-I-O, like this one on Franciscan prayer, anything she's written 18 books, they're outstanding. Now, she's a nun who's the senior theology professor at Villanova. And I had her come out to St. John's Ellicott City and do a special lecture. And we had a full house, about half Roman Catholic, about half Episcopalians. And she knew there was a table of Jesuits there. and she had more fun teasing them. Because she's a student of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was a Jesuit. And she kept saying, if he had read Francis and John Duns Scotus earlier in his life, we'd be looking at Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, OFM, not SJ. And the Jesuits they smiled. They got it. They were okay with it. So okay. Oops. There. Now the early documents were printed in over a 2-year period. The Saint in 1999, the Founder in 2000, the Prophet in 2001. These documents are, I didn't bring my copies with me because it's just a lot of bulk to carry around. And these documents really give us the best insight into Francis. It also helps understand what is unique to Francis, what isn't, and the various writers of Francis, like Bonaventure, Thomas Solano, Julian of Sprier. And they deal with and the 3 editors are Regis Armstrong, J. Wayne Hillman, and William Short. Now, that OFM stands for Orders of Friars Minor. And this is another thing. There are more Franciscans than any other order of the Roman Catholic Church, but they are not one order. There are 3 first orders. The Order of Friars Minor, which was created in 1893 by Pope Leo, merging all these other divergent Franciscan groups. The Order of Friars Minor Conventual, which they will claim to be the oldest because they had big houses and the observants and the spiritualists all split off from them. But if you want to have a Franciscan food fight, tell an OFM person that the conventuals are older. Personally, I think they are. And then the Capuchins, OFM Capuchins, come along much later. They make no claim to that. They are the more conservative Franciscans and somewhat more hermetical. They are a little more into the quiet and so the early documents helped us to see a lot of Francis. And it doesn't mean that things aren't accurate, like the Wolf of Gubbio, which you have on your church shield. It was really a teaching for nonviolence. That's what it's really all about. Whether there literally was Francis struggling with a wolf, doesn't matter. The imagery in there is powerful because it's all about how we cannot deal with violence. We have to deal with violence being nonviolent. It's a beautiful story. Okay. Now, poverty. Sine proprio means nothing of our own. And in the earlier rule, 1221, chapter 1, Francis says that. That's really the only thing he writes about poverty in that earlier rule is you'll have nothing of your own. Now, it had been assumed among religious life from the beginning of religious life in the 2nd century that you wouldn't have anything of your own. It would be owned by the order. And the 3 traditions of poverty, chastity, and obedience were always there. By the way, it's not celibacy. It's chastity. Now, of course, the church would say, but there's no such thing as a sexual relationship outside of marriage. Well, there is, but that's, but, there's also law. But anyway, so Francis doesn't say a lot about it as much as it's understanding that poverty is how we look at what God gives us. So the word there is nothing of our own. And when I was living at the Franciscan Study Center in the Kolbe House, named for Maximilian Kolbe, a renowned Franciscan saint who died in Auschwitz. He was trying to rescue the Jews. And then he got arrested and convicted, and he was eventually executed at Auschwitz. But in the Kolbe House, there was this very attractive piece of furniture that was a very elaborate liquor cabinet. And in there was a bottle of 100-year-old Napoleon brandy. And I had to ask, how does that jive with poverty? They said, well, it was given to us. And we use it as a gift. Okay. And on Sunday nights, the Colby house, we would always kind of do some kind of a get-together for the rest of the center, and we would cook food from our national heritage. And fortunately, there was a large number of Indian friars there, so we got some really good food. There's also a good Italian friar there, John Luca. We had some good Italian food. John Luca once told me, he said, John, do you believe in purgatory? I said, you know, it's interesting. In our tradition, purgatory is not a doctrine. It's actually in the Articles of Religion. He said, well, there is such a thing as purgatory, and I know where it is. I said, what is it? English cooking. I said, okay. But we would put on these elaborate meals. We'd get out all that. And it was not, you know, it's not like you live in with starvation and on minimal. It's that you see things not as your own. Okay, oops, I'm not doing this right. There. So there are two sins that the Franciscans speak of. The first sin is self-sufficiency, which means it's mine. I earned it. It's mine. I own it. And with that, we have a sense of entitlement. We have greed. We have hoarding. Now, I object to the fact that in common language today, we refer to Social Security and Medicare as an entitlement. If Francis were still alive, and he'd say, that's nonsense. You earned it. It's earned. And as a matter of fact, if you get a Social Security check, as some of us do, you realize your Medicare is taken out of it. So it's not like it's free. So entitlement to Francis meant that, you know, a sense of privilege. And he was very much a part of movement that was going on in that part of the late medieval times, where they were moving away from the idea that there was sort of two classes, a noble class, both a religious noble class and a secular noble class, and then there were the serfs. And now there's this rising, what he would call minority, but rising middle class. And what he's pointing out is that self-sufficiency, you think it's yours, I've got it, I own it, I am entitled to it, it's wrong. The other thing, and this is where I would talk to my friend from the Order of Urban Missioners, destitution, to be without, is a sin. So when people don't have enough to eat, or good housing, or good health care, or whatever, that's wrong. And it's up to those of us who have more to make sure those who have less get their share. And that, I think, is the important part about poverty. Later for the vestry meditation, I'm going to read this from Clare to Agnes of Prague. Whose power is stronger, whose generosity more abundant, whose appearance more beautiful, whose love more tender, whose courtesy more gracious. What a great and praiseworthy exchange, to leave the things of time for those of eternity, to choose the things of heaven for the goods of earth, and to receive the hundredfold in place of one, and to possess a blessed eternal life. So what it means by the doctrine of poverty is that we see things not as owners, but we're stewards, not possessors. And whatever wealth we have is a gift, and we live in thankfulness. And part of our thankfulness is we're willing to share. So when I saw 180 cars come through here a week ago Thursday, I thought, wow, beautiful statement. We're sharing what we have. And so to live with poverty is not to have nothing or to go out with the begging bowl, but it's to understand things as a gift and to appreciate everything God gives you and be willing to say, I will share mine with others. And so we always talk about abundance and not scarcity. Now this is one of the challenges I see, especially for the church today. We always have more than we think we have. And I think it's true for us individually. When I everybody, my wife and others tell me, you never retire, John, you flunked retirement. But well, that's true. But I am on the church pension fund, so I still collect my pension and on Social Security. And someone said to me, so is that like being on a fixed income? I said, I don't really like that word. Unless you have a commission or live off of trust or something, we don't have fixed income. It doesn't vary every week. And furthermore, I don't like the idea of thinking that because I'm retired that I don't have abundance. And I'm not trying to brag, but Sharon and I made a decision when I retired as bishop, active bishop, that we were not going to change our giving pattern. And it hasn't hurt us a bit. We do very well. So how you look at what you have is so important. If you think of it in terms of scarcity, there'll never be enough. If you think of it in terms of abundance, you're always saying, maybe there's more I can do. And this is not for people to be foolish with money. That's not it. It's to be aware that God does provide, and we oftentimes find that we have more than we think we do. Now, the earlier rule of 1221, Francis wrote this: there should be a gradual and prayerful total dependence on the grace of God. Now, depends on the grace of God doesn't mean that I don't have to do anything. God will drop the money down from the sky. But what it means is I'll put enough trust in God to know that God will lead me and direct me and help me to take care of what I need to take care of. And that's a hugely important thing. That may be the most difficult thing to do spiritually. The most important thing is to really understand our dependence on God. We always do yes, but. We got to stop doing that. God is going to take care. Now, I just mentioned one of the writings of Clare to Agnes of Prague. Clare was an extremely well-educated woman, an extremely attractive woman, in contrast to Francis, who was a seemingly unattractive man. She was a good bit taller than he was, but she was well-educated, and she came out of the majority, upper class, and she wrote some beautiful things to Agnes of Prague, with whom she had a relationship and communication. And she's the one that talked about the riches of God as against that of humanity. If we look at the riches of God, we become much more aware of what God's giving us. So this is, for me, why we do creation care, because that belongs to God, and we're called to be good stewards. That's why we take care of those in need, because they belong to God, and we're called to take care. And so it's a matter of, where do you see wealth coming? If we think it's something that I've got and I'm going to hold on to, and you can't have it, that's wrong. If we see it as something that I'm blessed with because it's from God, then I'm willing to share. Now, this is a long story thing called the Sacrum Commercium Beatae Francisci cum Domini Perpetua, which means a sacred exchange. This is something that Francis worked on for a long time, and this had more impact than we think. What he began to do was to show people the sacred use of money. And that will become a major shift in the 13th century and after that. That's where you start to see trade. Now, his father was a merchant. His father was not nobility. His family was well off, but they didn't have, by virtue of nobility, but they were cloth merchants. And what he said is a sacred exchange is when we start to look at money and resources as sacred. What's God want us to do with this? And that will eventually lead to all kinds of reforms within society. It will move to a much more equitable system. Now, there's an interesting story. Most of you may or may not be aware that J. Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan, was an Episcopalian. And he got into an argument with his rector, William Huntington Reed, New York, and eventually Reed said, look, you've got to treat your wealth as a sacred responsibility. And he had severed his relationship with Morgan for a while, and Morgan was getting ready to travel back to England, and he asked his rector to come see him off. And they went in somewhere quietly on the boat, and they made up. And what we began to see out of that was philanthropy. Even Andrew Carnegie, after he died, set up all that money for libraries. So philanthropy came out of that sacred exchange. So this is, the document itself is not, just remember sacred exchange. So Francis was at work helping people to understand how we use our money and our resources. Now, one of the things that's interesting in medieval imagery is Francis will frequently speak of, he'll use Lady Poverty. And there is a lot of that knighthood stuff in Francis about Lady Poverty and coming to the rescue of a damsel in distress and all that. The truth is, Francis was a soldier longer than Ignatius. And he bought into a lot of that sense of knighthood. He was injured at the Battle of Calistrata. And so you will find his writing, he's talking about Lady Poverty, and I'm in love with Lady Poverty. And it's just a way of him expressing it in a terms that made some sense then. It's not necessarily anything that's lasting or you don't hear people talking about today. So these are the four legacies of Francis for us today. It's gift, not possession. We're stewards, we're not possessors. As stewards means we're here to take care of what God's given us. And that goes all the way back to Genesis when God says you'll be able to name the creatures. And if you can name them, you're responsible for them. No one is to be without. When people are destitute, that's a sin, and we can't allow that. People have to have what they need for life, and not to. And that's one of the reasons why a major pillar in the Roman Catholic Church today is everybody has the absolute right to health care. We have it sort of in our church, but we haven't put it down as a doctrine of the church. We put it down as resolutions out of conventions. And it's always abundance over scarcity. And so to talk about poverty as the first pillar is to talk about how we look at our resources. We look at them as gift, we look at them as abundance, we look at them as to be shared, and we look at them as how best to serve God and God's people. So let me think that's my last slide. It is. So let me stop for a minute for any questions.
I have two, sorry. So I'm curious, when you were talking earlier about, that it's, that some of the concepts of poverty and we don't possess it, it's not ours.
Yeah.
How, it just a little bit, it reminds me of how I learned about socialism and how those two might connect or not connect, and if St. Francis had any, I know it was obviously Marx who, the true Marxist, well, that's communism, socialism, all of that, but I'm just curious what the impacts were, if you're aware of history of
Sure.
how one impacted the other.
I certainly can. There's no question that within Christian socialism, there was a great draw to a lot of, not just Francis, but poverty was not just the Franciscans. It was with the other Mendicant order, the Dominicans, and also with all religious orders. So there's no question about the connection there. They probably draw the line with Marxism because Marxism denies God. And Marxism is also predicated too much on class struggle, meaning the possibility of conflict and war. Now, you don't have to be a socialist to be a Christian. Now, My brother would tell me, oh, it's my brother, he's just a darn socialist. And I'm not. I think you can be a generous capitalist. But you're right. The roots of Christian socialism come in large part out of this. Now, there's some literature now starting to emerge that suggests that the social gospel of the late 19th century, Walter Rauschenbusch and others, that when the mainline church took it on, it became more self-serving, and that the real thing was that the social gospel was that in order for us to be servants of Christ, we must be generous servants. And the truth is, the most often repeated commandment that Jesus gives us is, whoever will be first of all will be last of all and servant of all. So there's now, so you're absolutely right. Christian socialism would draws heavily on this. When I was at the Franciscan International Studies Center, since most of the faculty lived in the UK, it's safe to say they were all laborites. No any question about that. They didn't have too much good to say about Margaret Thatcher. Tony Blair was the prime minister then, and they were okay with him, except they didn't think we should be in Iraq, but that's another issue. So, yeah, I think there's a connection.
And then my second question, as you talk about, and it's just a curiosity, as you talk about the rights for everybody should have access to health care.
Yeah.
And a lot of these fall within the United Nations human rights
They do.
listing, including the access to the internet and access.
Yeah.
Is there any correlation that with any of our church, Roman Catholic or Episcopal, are we looking back and forth? There's any coordination, because the United Nations has this kind of in place. Is there an adoption, perhaps?
There is, and there's a lot of, it's not a formal connection, it's more of informal in ways in which things overlap. The various churches have different entities connected with what we would call, justice ministries. In the Episcopal Church is Episcopal Relief and Development. Now, I'm going to be with a group of people tomorrow afternoon talking about developing relationships so we can support hospice and hospital work in Tanzania. And so within the churches, there are those movements. And most of the mainline churches have a representative of the United Nations. We do. Now, there's not a voting member or anything, but there are a lot of connections. Unfortunately, in the downsizing of a lot of the structures of all the mainline churches, some of that work has been cast aside, unfortunately. And that's unfortunate, because it's just unfortunate.
Powerful alliance to
Yeah.
causes.
But the Franciscans are heavily invested in two forms of ministries: healthcare and education. And most of their education is for people without. And one of the best examples I ever saw of poverty, well, you have to go sing, was in the Diocese of Cuttack, the Church of North India, which is Anglican. They have 16 schools and 4 major hospitals. And I was going up to Pagliaguda to take a gift for the church there from St. John's in Ellicott City. And as we're going up the road, I couldn't help but Bishop Doss's car was sort of avoiding all these big craters. And we went past this, looked like a military installation, barbed wire around it. There was a tank in front of it. And I said, Was that the army? He said, no, that's the police. I said, why the police? He said, well, the Naxalites are up here. I said, aren't they the Maoists? He said, yeah. And they're anti-government, yeah. And you'll probably run into some Naxalites at our service. I said, will we be safe? He said, oh yeah, they love us because we have hospitals, we have schools, we feed people, we take care of people. They don't know anything about our Christianity, but they know we're going to take care of people. So they support us and leave us alone. And I thought that's a beautiful example of working for peace. And now the Franciscans also have, they operate Our Daily Bread here in Baltimore. And they used to have St. Joseph's Hospital. And then St. Joseph's got into financial trouble with doing stents they shouldn't have been doing. Now it's on the University of Maryland. They haven't taken down the San Damiano crosses, and Francis' statue is still in front. But it's not a Franciscan hospital, which is sad. Then there's St. Elizabeth's School up on Argonne Drive, thank you. And that is special education. It's run by, I mentioned the three first order Franciscans, OFM, OFM Conventual, OFM Capuchin. Second order are the Poor Clares. Then there are 400 third orders. All those OSFs, they're not all the same. There's OSF Philadelphia, there's, you know. But you usually will find the Franciscans doing, and not living in big communities, usually living among people. We'll get into that when we get to the friars and the minor next week. But most of their work is generally in social service and outreach work.
Has there ever been a partnership with Chapaigo out of Hopkins?
Which one?
Chapaigo? It's a nonprofit arm of Hopkins. I know of it because a friend of mine is one of their coordinators. They do healthcare and logistics across most of the continent of Africa.
I don't know that. I'm not sure. One of the difficulties we run into is that lots of organizations who mean well are anxious to get tied into religious groups for fear that they're going to be seen as proselytizing, which is unfortunate.
Yeah.
But that I don't know. I do know that it took an arm and a leg to get a chaplaincy at Johns Hopkins, that's for sure. They do have one. It's kind of a stepchild, but.
Yeah.
But at Gilchrist, now we're part of GBMC, we have chaplains from all the Abrahamic faiths, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim. And, but we ostensibly had a religious beginning because we were formed when the Presbyterian, eye, ear, nose, and throat, and Baltimore Hospital for Women were merged in 1964. So yeah, it's. All righty, everybody. Well, next week I will talk about minority, and
I won't be here next week.
okay, and
I'm gonna try to listen in online.
okay.
Oh, that's like 2 hours earlier, so. I'm still
Pardon?
up. I said it's 2 hours earlier, but I should still be up.
Where are you going to be?
Sedona, Arizona.
Oh yeah.
So I'm gonna go do lots of hiking.
Oh good. It's a
And
pretty.
all
All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I know of St. Elizabeth's because St. Thomas had their services there when we sold.
Yeah, you
the
told me
Alameda
that.
and
Yeah,
the
I do know that. Yeah.
Towson building.
Well, they're still there. They still have their house, and